Should Aaron Glenn remain the top candidate for the New Orleans Saints in their search for a head coach? We'll talk about that right here on the Straight Up Saints podcast.
You're listening to the Straight Up Saints podcast.
What is up, Who Dat Nation? Welcome back inside another edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast. I'm your host, Chris Rosvoglu, and as always, the Straight Up Saints podcast is brought to you by Scott Vicknair Injury Lawyers. You've been injured in any kind of accident, car, truck, 18-wheeler, or hurt offshore, Scott Vicknair handles it all. You give him a call at 504-500-1111 for a free consultation. They'll always fight for the win. During the divisional round of the NFL playoffs, there was a pretty big upset, Commanders beating the Detroit Lions, and while that doesn't really do much for, or at least you'd think it wouldn't do much for a podcast that goes by the name of Straight Up Saints, it does matter because Aaron Glenn is one of the premier candidates for the Saints in their search for a head coach, and he can now interview in person since his season has ended. And I've noticed there's been interesting discourse around Aaron Glenn. I think for the most part, people did like him. Look, there's always going to be a group of people that don't want a defensive head coach, especially after you just finished up about 3 years of Dennis Allen. And I get that, right? You want something new. You want something away from what the Saints have known. And Aaron Glenn obviously spent many years coaching the Saints defensive backs. And when you spend time with the secondary, you've been part of that Sean Payton staff, I can get why people want them to go away. You want something new. I understand it. I get it. That said, I think Aaron Glenn is an intriguing candidate. There are some people, though, after a Saturday night's game that they think, hey, I don't know if I want Aaron Glenn anymore. That was a rough performance. Commanders did whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, on the road, tough environment. Just own that Detroit defense. And I get that. And I understand that. And don't get me wrong, that is not the performance that you want to put out on tape when that is your final showing and you're going for a head coaching job. I get that. But I do think it is very important to have context in every situation. And I do think it's very important if you're running a head coaching search to not put stock in just one game. If you are a good defensive coach for 17 games, and man, that one stinker is what cost you, I don't know if that franchise who thinks the one bad game is who you are as opposed to 17 good should be making that decision. That seems a little rash to me. And there are many reasons to like Aaron Glenn. And if you don't like Aaron Glenn, that's perfectly fine. I don't think you have to be told, hey, Aaron Glenn's the coach or else, and you can't like another candidate. You can like whoever you want. But for me, looking at Aaron Glenn, there's so many factors. And I think the first one, just from a leadership standpoint, there's not a guy in this league who will not talk about Aaron Glenn and his ability to command locker rooms in a high regard. Because look, don't get me wrong. You'll see throughout the playoffs some nice offensive coordinators, right? I think Joe Brady's a heck of a coordinator. I think Cliff Kingsbury's done an incredible job. But I've seen Cliff Kingsbury struggle when it comes to commanding a locker room in Arizona. Go look at the articles that were put out during his fallout in Arizona. Joe Brady's a young coach with no head coaching experience, and this guy, who, granted, great offensive mind, he's spending his time in the booths on Sunday. You got to spend every day, every second in the locker room with those folks and make sure you can galvanize them. I don't know if he'll be the guy. He might. He's an intriguing candidate. But there are question marks there from a leadership standpoint. So I think from that box, Aaron Glenn will check it off. I think Dan Campbell said it best. There probably isn't a coordinator in this league more prepared to be that head coach than Aaron Glenn. And look, for people that say, hey, I don't want a defensive head coach, that's cool. Guess what team just beat the Lions? A team led by a defensive coach. DeMeco Ryans and the Texans. First 2 years with a defensive coach. I'd say those are going pretty well. So to just knock a coach because they're defensive coach, I think that's dumb. My knock on Dennis Allen has never been that he's a defensive coach. My knock on Dennis Allen's been that his numbers, his record, would tell you he is a below 500 head coach by a pretty significant margin. And we've seen that throughout his career, whether it was with the Raiders or with the Saints. So leadership, love that about Aaron Glenn. I'm not going to let one game change my opinion. I think the ability to coach through adversity is important. We didn't want to hear it, right? We didn't want to hear the injury excuses this year for the Saints, and Lord knows we did hear it. I didn't hear any for the Lions, and I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. Injuries do matter, right? Aiden Hutchinson missed time, Malcolm Rodriguez missed time, Aleem McNeil missed time, Carlton Davis missed time, Emmanuel Mosley missed time, Derek Barnes missed time. Just go through their defensive depth chart. You'd have a better time listing the guys who are healthy as opposed to the guys who aren't healthy. That's how many injuries they've had. And yet they finished the year top 10 in scoring defense. They had a really good run defense the majority of the year. Now you want to attribute that to them getting ahead in games and teams having to abandon the run. Fine, you can do that if you want. But top 10 in scoring defense despite the fact that they didn't have their guys. And I think that's important Because forget about the excuses aspect of it, right? Who did and didn't make excuses, right? At the end of the day, you still have to coach. And for Detroit to lose guy after guy after guy in terms of important players, right? Like Aiden Hutchinson's obviously a premier player in this league. I think Aleem McNeil is one of the better players that doesn't get talked about on Sundays. To lose those type of players and still have a very, very good defense is important. And the funny thing is, everyone's going to rip him for this game, right? Against the Commanders and then looking flat. In order to get the number 1 seed, they were in a position on week 18 against the Vikings, which was a great offense throughout most of the season. And what did Aaron Glenn do? He had that offense absolutely stifled in the red zone. So I think that he is still, regardless of the circumstance of what you saw yesterday, a very good defensive coach. And if you want to put it all on one game and say, man, this is not what I don't want a coach who just gave up that many points in a playoff game. I think it is hilarious to think of the team that just beat them, because Dan Quinn, in his final game as the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys, they gave up 48 points to the 7-seed Green Bay Packers in that game. And if you had asked the Washington Commanders today, do you feel good about hiring Dan Quinn? I think you know their answer. They're playing for a conference title next Sunday, whether it's against Philly, Rams. Obviously, at the time of recording this, that game hasn't played yet. But, you can't just put stock all in one game. I think that is so crazy to do. So I think Aaron Glenn is still an intriguing candidate. It doesn't mean he has to be the guy for the Saints. They can go in another direction. But I think the first thing they need to do, whether it's offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator, you need a great leader of men that is going to have a vision for this team. I'd like to think he can do that. I'd like to think there's other candidates that can do that as well. Obviously, it's not just down to Aaron Glenn, right? There's a couple of candidates the Saints can hire that I would genuinely be excited about. Aaron Glenn being one of them, obviously, of course. I could get excited about Joe Brady. Mike McCarthy wouldn't get me as excited, but there is a floor there with a coach like him where you feel like you're going to win 10, 11 games. Might get bounced in the playoffs early, but at least you get there. There are coaches that I could be excited about. For Aaron, though, to use this one game against him would be crazy. So I personally don't think that the loss of the Commanders should change anything for Aaron Glenn, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people that feel that way.
From the football playoffs to college and pro basketball to the rush of hockey, it's all happening. And you can get in on all the action of the sports you love at DraftKings Sportsbook. With so many sports, there's almost unlimited opportunities to place your first bet every day. Try betting on something simple like picking a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, pick your team, and place your bet. And here's something special for all new customers. Bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Make every day game day with DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code BOOT. That's code BOOT, B-O-O-T, for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. DraftKings, the crown is yours.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas, 21 and over. Age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Void in New Hampshire, Oregon, and Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. For additional terms and responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/ftball. NFL Plus Premium offer available only to new and former NFL Plus subscribers. Additional NFL Plus Premium terms at nfl.com/terms.
So what do you think about the Saints head coaching situation? Do you still want them to pursue Aaron Glenn? Do you want them to go other routes? Let me know in the comment section below. Definitely curious to see how this goes. I think this will ramp up for New Orleans now that he is someone that they can get in person. Obviously, they can go the Mike McCarthy route and bring him in person as well. They'll have a little bit more options. This isn't to say that the search is done. Obviously, the Saints have more work to do. They've done virtual interviews with Kellen Moore, a virtual interview with Joe Brady. So they'll go through the options and we'll see where they eventually land. I'd imagine the decision, though, will come within the next week or two, hopefully, for the Saints. But we'll see what happens. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for the Who Dat Nation.